Welcome to Gilded Heroes, Jewelry, Metalwork, Military Power, and Queer Longing. I am John Stewart Gordon. I am the Benjamin Atmore Hewitt Curator of American Decorative Arts here at the Yale University Art Gallery. And I'm joined by...
Hi, everybody. I am Aaron Decker, a jeweler, enamelist, and artist based out of Detroit, Michigan. I am currently one of the 2022 Center for Craft Career Advancement Fellows, as well as a recent AJF finalist, and am represented by Ornamentum Gallery based out of Hudson, New York.
I'm really excited about today. This conversation was sparked by two things that are currently going on at the Yale University Art Gallery. So here's your paid advertisement for your free entertainment today. My pandemic project was to organize an exhibition called Golden America, Artistry, Memory, Power, that's currently on view, and it's on view through July 10th of this summer. And what is brand new at the gallery that just opened last Friday is American Jewelry, the Susan Grant Lewin collection at the Yale University Art Gallery, which is an installation that celebrates the recent gift of over 2,000 works of American jewelry from the collector Susan Grant Lewin. And in thinking about programming, I kind of had the idea of doing something that kind of linked the two installations, and the first name that came to my mind was Aaron Decker. And it's fairly obvious because his work is in the Susan Grant Lewin installation, this work, Underloud. And it became kind of the touch point for me thinking about his work and the genesis of our conversation today. But I was wondering, you don't need a curator to tell you about your work when you have the artist here. So Aaron, do you want to introduce this work to people?
Yeah, I'd love to. So this piece is called Underloud, and it's one of several pieces that was in my first solo show at Ornamentum Gallery called Derby and His Batches. And I believe Susan actually saw it either during that show or pretty soon after that show. But in that body of work, it was from my time at Cranbrook Academy of Art, where I graduated and got my master's from, and my professor was Iris Eichenberg. In this work, it was really me finding my voice and finding myself in terms of my artistic content. So a lot of this body of work has to do with my background. I'm a military kid. I grew up on military bases all across the United States, Alaska, Maine, Maryland, New Jersey. And in this piece, it was really me figuring out these military references, why I was so attracted to military material, why I was so attracted to this like grayness, this almost like tattered, broken, war-torn object that's a wearable brooch. So in this piece, there are squares of nickel with piercings, and then holding it all together is actually small sewn pieces of a military blanket. So the actual soft structure is holding the hard structure underneath together. And then the funniest thing about this piece is you have literally a loudspeaker mouth. It's sort of like those political loudspeakers with its tongue sticking out, sewn from really supple leather. So what's supposed to be a loud, hard object is actually a flaccid gesture in this piece. So you have this hardness that is the underlying structure that's just covered by all this soft, flaccid material. And that is really, I think when I think about that work and when I think about this work, it's because of my teaching and because of who was my professor that I came into this way of working with material in a really emotional way. And that can really be seen in some of Iris Eichenberg's pieces. And one of the ones that we have is this piece. In this piece, there is fabric, there is layering of images, of material, these buttons, this sort of ephemera. And in her work, what I really loved and what I learned during my time at Cranbrook is treating material with its emotional content and understanding that's not just something to construct physical objects with, but it's actually something to construct meaning with, a lot like writing. So you're using the material to actually get at the content rather than just using the material to illustrate something. And that was something that I sort of worked through in my time at Cranbrook. And it's still sort of like percolating in the back of my head, even now in the work I make. And with Cranbrook and that work at Ornamentum, I remember having conversations with people that work looked like it came from Cranbrook, and that was in a negative sense. And I feel very strongly that can't be that's furthest from the truth for me. It's actually, if that work looks like Cranbrook, I'm very proud of that, because that's a lineage of making, and that's a lineage of thought that I'm very proud to be a part of. So it's in that work that I sort of found my voice, found my content, and Iris gave me the framework to really explore that. And I'm so thankful for that. And in her work, I think one of the main parts that is the common thread between that work that I made and this kind of work is that there's always a body present. So not to mention that jewelry goes on bodies, but also that jewelry is about the body or about bodies. So there's always a body present. There's always a person present. Jewelry is not without people. There's always a person there. And I think that's where we sort of connected on the topic of the Golden Show. And
yeah, I just want to, it's so fascinating. As a curator, I look at the world a slightly different way. And I think the lineage between teacher and student is so important. And it may be partially because at Yale Art Gallery is associated with a teaching institution. We think about pedagogy very seriously, and we try to collect the works of important teachers and proponents of their field, and then we love also having the student relationships. I'm like, for me, like, oh well, that's so fascinating that this is related to Iris's work, and that's a plus. I love the tension that in a different setting that's perceived as a negative. But
it can be. I think in any art setting, being too close to your mentor can be seen as derivative or a lack of originality. And I think while those things can be true and are true at times, I also think we need to understand that these things are not made in a vacuum. That these lines of thought travel with the work and travel through the work, and that's actually really beautiful. And it's a really beautiful part of any art making, is that there is always going to be a lineage of thought, whether it's your mentor, whether it's your family, whether it's your background. There's always something there that's you and the person before you.
Yeah, and you're a passionate advocate of kind of narrative jewelry.
I am, yeah. I very much am, and I don't know if that's in vogue right now. I remember coming through schooling and it was not in vogue at all, and it was very much to be abstract, use material as a way of expressing yourself in a way that's non-narrative and not tied to a story. And very much I love storytelling, writing. My original degree before I became a jeweler was in English and literature, so I think very much in not narrative but words. Like words are the way I construct. It's how I build, and that's how I actually get into the work. And for most people working with me, they see how I talk about my work, and it's very different than the work. And that's just how I approach it.
And I'll say that is how I approach things. When I was working on the Gold exhibition, I got really caught up in story, and I find the history in objects to be so compelling, and it's how these objects come to life, is understanding the past. And with this is an installation shot from the exhibition, showing a group of 4 objects, and the story is what got me. This whole cluster centers around the smallest object that you can barely see, which is a gold box right at the center of the screen, dwarfed by this portrait and the sword. But it's this whole story about Baron von Steuben, this Prussian military hero who has to leave Prussia, and he joins the Continental Army, and he brings with him the latest military training tactics, concepts of hygiene. He really professionalizes the Continental Army, and is kind of a driving force for kind of the military success of the revolution. And he rises to the top of the ranks in the military, becomes friends with George Washington, all this. And in Yale's collection, we have this cluster of objects. We have his military sword. This isn't the one he was stabbing people with. He would process with this, and it's the one that's actually in the portrait. This portrait was commissioned by the mayor of New York. It's rather kind of bombastic depiction, in the grand manner of this man with all his military accoutrement. And in the center is a gold box that was presented to him by the city of New York. And in my research, the stories that were coming out was that the reason Steuben had to leave Prussia, it was he was about to be called up under charges of homosexuality, and he needed a quick escape. So he joins the Continental Army, working freelance. Yeah, I mean, he needed cover, and he has two aides de camp while he's in the army, and we're now kind of coming to understand that those are probably personal relationships as well as professional relationships. And after the war, he even sets up home. He lives with his aide de camp, William North, in kind of this post-war domestic life. And he adopts North as his son. And in his will, he leaves North the sword, the gold box given to him by the city of New York, and the portrait. So much of what you see survives because it was given as a bequest from Steuben to his adopted son and probable lover, William North, and then they descend in the North family together. And so when I was reading this story, thinking about the story, I was like, oh, this is so fabulous. And it's a way of rereading military history. There's an artist I know of who I think would like a story about queerness in the military. So let me just send an email off to Aaron Decker, and I'll just, out of the blue, I'm just going to share this story. So I write it all up, I push send, I give him images, and then nothing.
Yeah, on my end, it wasn't nothing. It was me receiving an email like that with such amazing content that I went, how have I been blind to this figure? And just all of the content that brings up, and I wrote it down because you just said it, he took cover. He took cover underneath a power structure. And that was one of the first things that came to mind when you sent me that email. Like, this is one of those figures who camouflage themselves into a structure, and that structure actually protected them. And even if that structure was military, even if it was about war, about violence, there's a certain taking advantage here. And that's what strategy and war is all about, right? It's about finding the opening and looking to take the advantage over the enemy. And then this idea of lovers and soldiers and having to hide that or not hide it. What does that mean? Bequeathing objects to his lover, who was also his adopted son, because that's how it worked back then. You couldn't have a male lover and they get all the things that are in your life. You have to, there are systematic ways to get there. So it took me about 2 weeks to write you a 1-sentence response that said, I will get back to you in another week. And then I think at the end of that week, I just said, we need to get on the phone and talk because I can't actually write this email. Because it's just such an interesting idea that I think a lot of people, we tend to separate these days of the military is bad, queer and gay, it's good. And the fact that this figure is in it conflicts with that binary. Mm-hmm. And I think when things conflict with that binary, there's so much interest there of why. Why do we understand these things? Why do we categorize these things? Why are we interested in these things? And then just this figure, this image that you sent me is high drag. This is this figure's identity in a system. This isn't his home identity. This is not a personal portrait. This is a depiction of someone to communicate something other than who they are in private. This is very much a stage being built for this person to show their military badges, the sword, this honor, um, makeup, heels, beautiful clothing. He's not wearing this in the field killing people.
No.
Like this is a costume. It's costuming. And just that is so fascinating to me as a jeweler, because objects can transport us, they can bring us those places, and they can act as those indicators. They can act as camouflage, they can act as shields. And military badges do all those things, and they're huge indicators of rank, of file, of place. And they've been in Western military for a very long time. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
so it was just, I guess, short to say, my mind was blown. It was just blown.
Yeah, it was yeah, that's such a fascinating conversation we had. Because also like then getting back to kind of this public persona, you're right. These portraits are, yeah, these are stylized, they are abstracted, and they're all part of a public discourse. And that's what the kind of the rest of the objects that surround it are. Oh, I mean, the object at the center of this group that relates is incredibly public object. And it's small, it would fit, it's like the size of a mouse, it would fit in the size of your hand. It is meant to be kind of held and cherished, and like it has a lid, it opens, but really only you can see what's inside of it. Um, but it has this kind of symbolic public life. This is a freedom box. It's something that is bestowed by a city or a town on an individual as an honorific. If you've ever heard the tradition of someone getting the keys to the city, it's this same tradition. You used to get like a proclamation with a box or keys.
Mm-hmm.
And this is New York in 1784. Just the war is still kind of unfolding. Fighting has stopped, but like we are still in a wartime mentality. And this city that's now in a liberated state, in a liberated country, is carving out its public identity, and it's doing so by aping the traditions of Europe, because giving these boxes is an old tradition. It rarely happened in the colonies, and in the early United States, there are actually only 3 boxes known. This was from a commission that was supposed to honor 5 people. Only 2 were made. So it's a rare thing, and it's very pompous. It has the seal of the city of New York engraved on the top. This is engraved by a specialist engraver named Peter Rushton Maverick, who was cutting the dies for coinage and the plates for currency. And this is a version of this seal that only came into being in early 1784. So this is very current. And then, wrapping around it is this, all caps. It's like on the outside of a Roman, ruin, like the inscription talking about presented by this corporation of the city of New York. It is so pompous. I'll dive back in a second. But the underside has the dedicatory inscription. And it says, October 11th, 1784, Frederick William Baron, they do it in the French way, de Steuben. And that is the proper inscription. When it passes down, William North then has it re-engraved to add his name. William North ends up marrying a woman, Mary Duane. She's the daughter of the mayor of New York. They have a family. Of their 3 children, 2 of them are named after Steuben. And this goes to one of their children, who's William Augustus Steuben North. So he's kind of carrying that history in his name, and he adds his name to it. So, and this is the private side of the box. This is the box, like, you have to actually have this thing in your hands to see this. And just for everyone who's wondering who this guy is, here's Steuben and North together again after so long. Um, and these kind of generations kind of passing between each other. Yeah, so I love the idea that this really public story then has this hidden covered story that's physically kind of engraved on the surface.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about this kind of covering versus actual military covering is meant to hide in a natural environment. This, of course, is in a sense, but the environment's not natural. The environment's built. Hold on one second. I live right next to a firehouse.
No, it's on the military theme. I think everyone's
it is, yeah.
You planted that.
But in this situation with those portraits, the environment's built, the stage is set. So it's not about hiding, it's about showing, and it's about presenting. It's about presenting an identity to basically like shield, where regular camouflage in the military is really about hiding to get an advantage. This is still in that sense, but there's two different sensibilities in each of them. And then in the box, or just the idea of the box, the underside versus the front, that plays very much into some not jewelry theory, but some concepts around jewelry, around brooches, around the underside of something versus the front facing. What's the back of a piece versus what's the front of a piece? What do you see? What don't you see? What are the personal, intimate moments that you get to have with the piece that other people will not? And I think that's exactly this is, of course, everyone's going to see the front of this thing when they open a jewelry box, but that moment when someone's alone with this object and they're actually touching it, they get to explore it. And it's an intimate exploration in something. So you get to see the underbelly in a sense. And that this object's made of gold and like some of the richest material in the world, even now still, is a signifier. It's a signifier of wealth, it's a signifier of importance, it's a signifier of a moment, it's a signifier of honor. It's also about reward, right? It's about giving reward for something relating to what this person did or does.
Yeah, and I think that idea of gold is just so important, and this just so happens to be an image of Alaska for Aaron. This is our placeholder image. This is a phenomenal photograph of a gold mine, a current gold mine in Fort Knox gold mine up in Fairbanks, Alaska. But yeah, this is a material with freight.
It is. It's very much a material. In some of our initial conversations, we talked about how gold underpins some of the most widely used metaphors and analogies in the world. And that it is the measure by which currency is slated against or has been slated against in the past. It is something we still measure things by. It's still valued for its use in jewelry. It's still valued for its use in much more products now. But I think we can't escape this material is one of the things that's really fascinating is humans can't escape gold because it's so tied to our development and our history as cultures. And it's been very prevalent. And maybe it's like you could even go back to the very beginning and say gold wasn't there, but value was, transaction was, and an assessment of value was. And gold has always been that. And for me, as an artist working in enamel, I don't work in gold very often, but I work in enamel a lot. And what I love about both of these materials is something that most people probably don't like about the materials is that gold, enamel, gemstones, any of those materials of high jewelry are super tied to military violence, to cultural violence, to the embodiment of colonialism, to the embodiment of monarchies and dictatorships. And that money, that gold, those objects, Fabergé eggs, the royal jewels, they sit at the top. And the only reason why societies have a top tier is because they had to knock out other societies, or they had to knock out other areas, or they had to take resources from people that weren't theirs. And that this material, gold specifically is so much tied to that content,
Mhm.
and we love it because it's beautiful, but I think it's beautiful because it has such a complicated history for me. And it's
Yeah.
the same with enamel. It's like it has such a strong, complicated history, in terms of it's been used across military medals, across regalia, and that's something we don't really acknowledge very often, right? It's something we accept jewelry as a part of the world just being gold and silver. Those materials have a very violent history. Diamonds have a violent history, and as artists, I think it's a lot of responsibility goes on us to use that history to educate or to use as content or to engage interest in, because it's not just about the color.
Yeah.
It's
I would
about the
say that I would just add that you're completely right. I'm in total agreement, but I don't think it's history, it's present. And
yeah.
I think what strikes me about why I use this photograph often when I talk about gold is um, we are less concerned with military conquest, although I will say my exhibition opened the week that Russia invaded the Ukraine and gold hit an all-time high that week. And it was fascinating that in times of political instability, we still fall back into this material.
Yeah.
So when I started thinking about this, we didn't have an international military event going on. We do now, so we're back to that old story, but we're thinking kind of more, critically about gold, and just, I think that's another level of violence and another level of political control. And just for those of you who can't quite see what's going on in this image, it looks so nice. Here's a huge detail. You get this vast scale of these enterprises that are funded by state. They're funded by international corporations. The amount of physical and economic cost that goes into this material, yeah, has an ancient history, but it runs right up to the present. And I think I want to get, you've mentioned kind of high drag and badges a little bit, and I think
Mm-hmm.
it's a good place to dive in because, yeah, this is some high drag.
It is, and like the piece in the Susan Lewin show right now, that body of work, it was literally called Derby and His Badges.
Mm-hmm.
um, and I'm just so interested in this idea of an object that represents, it's a bit macabre, but it's an object that honors the horrors of war
Mm-hmm.
being worn, so that these medals likely represent bodies, like could represent lost life, they could represent colonial takeovers or over location, and they're celebrations that people wear. They're not object to be ashamed of, they're exact opposite. They're object to be incredibly proud of. To be so proud to wear something like this and then get your portrait painted, to
Yeah.
like double ensconce this thing that exists now, is like I don't want to just wear it. I now want to be captured wearing this thing. That is both horrifying and amazing. And maybe that, and like in my work or the way I think about these things, those two words tend to overlap very often.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and with badges, it is that language. It's that language in jewelry, again, that I think a lot of people not take for granted, but we don't use the format of the badge for its real like historical precedence and what it could mean and what it does mean for politics, for military, for movements. And this is a great example of one, like an illustrative point of this badge, and any military badge represents something, and
Yeah.
it's about being proud of the structure, being proud of this militaristic idea, being proud of the state. And I find that, yeah, just really fascinating. And I don't know why, but I think it has to do with growing up in the military, being conflicted about my identity as being queer and what that means. And I guess I could say the badges of honor that I'm not allowed to wear as a straight person who really wanted to be a soldier. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I remember having those inklings as a kid of wanting to be like my dad and wanting to take on that. And that's sort of like the impetus of the show Derby and His Badges. Is like me finding conflict of like trying to be something I just cannot be.
Yeah.
Um,
And that tension is historical. I mean, if you look at someone like Steuben, yeah, he's This is not his badge, it's a similar one,
Yeah.
but the Society of the Cincinnati, for example, is founded in 1783, so the year before he gets that box. Its kind of formative meeting is held at his house. So he's not the founder of it, but he was the host of the party. He was in the room where it happened, and that becomes part of his calling card socially, that he is kind of one of the architects of this organization. And here's a detail: this badge, it was designed by Pierre L'Enfant, who is the French engineer and the architect of the city of Washington, D.C. It's all about peace. This idea of Cincinnatus. It's a Roman military hero who they asked for him to be emperor, and he says, no, I want to go back to my farm, and hands over his sword. And that's what you see him doing in this, is giving back his sword.
Yeah.
The bird, this eagle of the United States, has 2 laurel wreaths in each talon. So it's the eagle of peace. But all of that is predicated on violence. And you can't, the importance of peace only exists in juxtaposition to the warfare that necessitates it. And it's so it's this fascinating twist of I don't know, just to be totally glib about it, Steuben's probably holding this party, William North is in the kitchen making dinner, and yet they're making this whole organization about how to honor military victory, and then they're all partaking in it. So it's
Well, and I remember we talked about too, the other point about this that I'm very much interested in is this transactional idea of medals being given. And this idea of, how do you incentivize violence? You reward it. How do you incentivize any behavior? You reward it. So in this sense, these rewards are to incentivize people into becoming a part of the club, being honored. What isn't great about being honored? I think all of us would have an urge to be in this position of someone respecting us, having power. It's attractive, it's seductive, but we have to call it for what it is these are gifts given, badges of accomplishment that people strive for. They don't just they're not just given because someone's good at their job. They're given because that person needs to be good at their job and needs to be good at what the military needs them to do. And when they're good at it, they get a reward.
When we were talking about this presentation on Monday, you said something very similar, and it struck me. I was like, oh, but it's not always happy. But there are very few instances where it's not happy. And it reminded me of this painting in Yale's collection. This is Thomas Aiken's portrait of George Reynolds, who was a student of his. Reynolds was in the cavalry in the Civil War. And then he goes to the Pennsylvania Academy to study with Aikens. What most people don't notice in this image is tucked into his lapel is his Medal of Honor that he is awarded. So this is the military veteran in the less kind of pompous light. And I think it's the other side of that. Our badge is actually good. And
and I remember seeing this portrait, and I think everyone in this talk can probably see it too. We all know what this look is, or we all sense emotionally what this look might mean. It's sort of like this disconnect from where you are. You're looking at something that's not there. You're being haunted almost by something that is not seen outside the frame. And this image is very different than the portrait of Steuben in that sense, where that's all about show off, pompousness, being the image. This is very much capturing someone possibly reflecting. And the thing that's very uncanny here is, like you said, the badge, which is supposed to be the thing that signifies accomplishment, is very much hidden on plain clothes. But it's also something, possibly it's still there because this person can't escape it. And it's supposed to be a reminder for them that they did something good, but it also might be a burden they have to carry. And I think that's an interesting two sides of the coin with badges, is that they are both. They're not just a single thing. They operate in two worlds very differently, but those worlds don't exist apart from one another. We just think they do because we're willing to suspend belief in the hopes of preserving our own mental stability, probably.
Yeah. Yeah. And we don't strive for the emotional state that this man is in. We strive for an emotional state that is more proud and
Yeah.
and upright.
Yeah, it's such a haunting image.
Yeah, and I will say I've increased the color and brilliance of it for this talk. It's very, you really have to hunt to find this military badge, but it's so fascinating that Akins just tucks it into the shadows. So it's there looming, even if it's not right up front.
Yep.
Awkward transition, things that loom.
I don't think it's an awkward transition. I think it's actually a pretty appropriate one. And it gets back to that binary, right, of the two images that we just saw of Steuben versus the second portrait. I'm sorry, I'm completely blanking on the name. But this idea that I said about gold and its representation as a material, as something having a really dark undercurrent. And then Steuben's portrait being the pompousness and the underside being a bit darker. In this piece, this is from my recent solo show at Ornamentum called It's Not All Fun and Games. And this is a piece called Cut My Teeth. And I often work in titles specifically to say something about the work. And in this piece in particular, it is that binary. It is that darkness, lightness. It is that monster that's a toy. So it's like, again, back to that work of Susan, it's the neutered war idea. It's like, I'm trying to really bring this thing into a kid's hands. And the color of enamel is important. The way it's put together is important. Overall, though, enamel as a material in this piece is my callback to metals. So all these silver pieces are sort of inlaid with enamel color. The actual face and brooch, they're actually two different pieces. So if you're actually thinking about this object as a combination of things, they come apart.
Let me.
Yeah. There we go. So then this is a much higher definition image, but all the silver on this piece is dark gray and black. So you can wear it in reverse and it's completely black necklace. That only the color is for you, and the brooch comes off to be just a monster without eyebrows. So it's an expressionless monster, sort of like a dead soldier that you confronted in the field, but it's like a toy. It's this V shape that's also very common in military badges, stuck in its mouth, and also this ribboning that's in its mouth is also very much military metals. So this piece is a weird sort of like concoction of all the things that I was thinking about. And then specifically with the pattern and talking about Steuben's queerness and hiding queerness, this clown pattern that came from an interaction that I had when I was a child, where my father basically compared being queer to being a clown. And in these pieces for that show, It's Not All Fun and Games, I sort of took the language of badges and keychains, and I decided to make things for me to wear, to be proud of, that retook all that violent language, retook all that clown language, and allowed me to then pride myself in the things that I should be ashamed of based off the external world, and in my internal world be like, no, these are the things that make me who I am. So in this piece, Cut My Teeth, it's also very much a nod to the enamelist community, because I am not a traditional enamelist in any sense. I use enamel outside of old frames or outside of traditional illustrative objects. I use it very much like a kid experimenting, and I get with the material, and I've tried so hard to learn the material. And Cut My Teeth is sort of me saying to the enameling world, it's like, I finally cut my teeth, and this is my work. I've come to this point in it. So this work was very much that binary badge that we just mentioned. It's sort of like been the running theme throughout. It's about wearing something that you're proud of, but that pride might also be embedded in a dark and violent history that you can't escape. And that's sort of like the overarching theme of that show, is where all that work came from.
That was, I have a few questions for you. I'm
Yeah.
going to invite anyone who'd like to ask us a question
Yeah.
to put it into the Q&A. I will make us larger, and we can have a discussion. I'm just so fascinated by this evolution. I mean, it's wonderful to have such an early work of yours in the art gallery's collection, and then this later part, we'll say mid-career, because I hope you have a long career beyond this.
Early career.
Early mid-career. Yeah, someone called me a mid-career curator the other day, and I went to smack him. I'm like, that makes me sound like I'm old.
I got a long life. I'm hoping.
But it is these themes of military, of covering, of camouflage are this common thread. But I'm really struck by the difference in the haptic experience.
Yeah.
The enveloping warmth of the blanket and the leather versus the difficulty of things like cut my teeth and your current things that have spikes and have edges, and they are they're more challenging physically. And I'd love to know more about that arc.
It's funny. I think about the arc in a specific way, and I think I guess the only way to talk about it is to talk through the thinking of it. When I was at Cranbrook making that work, that content was so fresh and new for me that I had to give myself a blanket to be able to come to terms with it and make that work. And it's also in that work, there was this, I talked about it in terms of Iris's work, but there were bodies present, and there were two bodies present in that first work. And in that first work, it was very much a relationship between, let's say, a soldier and his wife. And those were the two sort of conceptual bodies that I was letting happen. So the hardness being about the softness, the emotionality, and whether that's for either party, it's just about understanding that concept. And then the shift into the harder work with the spikes was really about me not being as gentle with the bodies that I was interested in, and referencing objects such as keychains and toys that do rattle, that are awkward. But then the spikiness, or this, I'm even wearing one of the pieces that has one of the spiky maces on it, actively bringing something in that's uncomfortable, because it's easy to reference it in image. I think it's even more impactful to make something physically uncomfortable, because that is what jewelry can do. And it can actually work on a haptic level. So as an artist, I'm very much interested in taking advantage of that. So that arc to that work was really me, like that first work was about comfort, understanding, and enveloping myself in those two bodies, and like covering things and cradling that, because it was a very emotional experience. And then into this newer work, it was very much like I became assertive in my work. So that came out. And it's very much where I am in my thinking in the work. And that's sort of the haptic experiences come from. And I struggle with whether there's a thread throughout my work. I struggle with that question pretty often. And I think that's just an internal voice in my head. But it's something I think every artist struggles with. But there was a huge shift also in color, in terms of the application color. The first works are very much gray muted, and this was very much color, like full on everywhere. And that was me really saying, like, I'm going to be as queer, gay, I'm going to be whatever I want to be in this work. And I'm going to allow that into this work, and I'm going to allow it to hit directionally right into the grayness of my work. So a lot of the work has gray components, but they're covered up by color, or the backsides are gray. So it's like, I'm basically like, basically saying shush, 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 shush to the grayness, and really just trying to bring more of the conflicted color with that into it.
Interesting. When I first saw Underloud in Susan Lewin's apartment, I was there with my colleague Pat Kane and Alexandra Ward, and Alexandra Ward's the one who really organized the installation of Susan's material. We were all kind of blown away by it. it had such power, and it had like an really kind of an unusual authority. But from what I understand, you were not as immediately taken with that work. Um,
Yeah. I think that happens every now and then. Actually, it happens in pretty much every body work. In the newest body work, there's one piece that I really hate, but it's there, and I let it be there.
mhm.
That piece of work for Derby and his badges was that piece of work, and it was something that when I made it, I thought was horribly ugly, and I didn't think it worked at all. Um, I was so conflicted with it, and I think one of the things that is that lineage of teaching that I really pull from Iris about, and it's not something that is, I wouldn't say it's an aesthetic, it's a thinking. And she kind of always mentions this idea that don't run from that when that happens, run into. Because those are usually the openings. And at that time, I ran away. I was like, no, 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 no. This is not where I'm going. This is not what's happening. I'm going to like put this in a box, put it away, develop the other work as I go. But this is a failure. Um, and then I let it in the show because sometimes you have to let your failures in the shows because to me they might be a failure, but that's just me. Like that might be me putting parameters on something that I don't yet understand. Because at the end of the day, and this is going to be not a controversial thing to say, but a weird thing to say. I might not know everything about my work, and that's important for me to assert for myself, and that allows me freedom to keep on making it,
Yeah.
and allows me not to be inhibited by barriers when they come up, and that I need to free myself and say I don't know sometimes what this thing is, but is it allowed to exist here? Of course, because who am I to say it can't? Um, so I tend not to over edit when I come into shows and like pull things away. If it's here and it's, I think even more so, if it's not what I want, I will put it in. If it's sort of like a medium where I'm like, I'm not sure, that might go away. But if it's a strong statement, like that piece is a strong piece and I can recognize that. I just didn't understand it. I didn't know what it was.
Yeah, I think I appreciate your honesty on that, because I mean it's not to be too Jungian about it, but I don't think we fully do understand why we do what we do, and there are connections that are subconscious. There are connections that, and um, and I think it's always a challenge to get artists to talk about their work, because we often want a perfect package, being like, please list every single influence and all childhood trauma
Yeah.
and all benefit,
Yeah.
like, yeah, and put them in paragraph form, Times New Roman, thank you.
Yeah.
And
Elevator speech.
yeah, and it's not there. And I think, yeah, there sometimes it takes an outside voice to say, is this the connection you were thinking about? Or it may take a long time. So I as the person who often is having to draw those connections, I appreciate the partial roadmap that artists give us, but I'm aware that often that roadmap is incomplete or sometimes purposely misleading. So that's,
Yeah, and I think that's another great analogy that came up at Cranbrook. A map is a representation of something, but not the actual thing.
yeah.
And you can never actually get to the actual thing until you go and experience it.
Yeah, and someone just actually commented that also like the other relationship is the viewer. It's
Yeah.
so the maker makes something, but then the viewer also has their complete um, their baggage, their insights, and
Mm-hmm.
that completes the relationship of the kind of the reactions you couldn't anticipate.
Yeah, and I find those way more exciting because I remember when Susan saw that piece, and I think I can remember this. She like her eyes lit up, and I was surprised. I was very surprised that that was the piece because for me that wasn't the piece. Um, and now like more people have seen it. It's been out in the world more, and I understand it more. Do I love that piece? I don't know. I still don't know. I think it's a great piece, and I think it's amazing. I think it's very representative of my work in a transition. But it's like I don't know. It's almost too personal. It's like something I can't hide behind. Is that piece? I do like it about that, but I also hate it at the same time.
Well, I'm sorry, I'll stay in the public realm for a
No,
little while.
a very long time.
Someone's asked about the imagery on the gold box, and it's it's the seal of the city of New York, which is a fascinating thing. Talk about autobiography in images. It's very much an autobiography of the city. It is a Anglo-Dutch figure standing on one side of a crest and a Native American figure on the other side. And in the middle, there's quartering of windmills and beavers. So talking about like early trade and the fact that so much of the early colonial history was negotiations, iniquitous negotiations with Native peoples to populate the land, also, but a lot of mutually beneficial trade agreements. And so it's really kind of like, it's supposed to be a history of New York or the colonial past. And what's funny is it was a celebratory image when it came out, and it actually has been fascinating to really kind of look at that image anew in the past few years and be like, huh, it's a complicated image.
Yep.
And what made the version that Peter Russian Maverick engraved on that box so different from the previous generation is that the figures are armed. And so the indigenous figure is holding a bow, the colonist figure is holding a gun, and you get it that like in an 18th century mindset, those are just tropes. If you're going to make kind of the archetype caricature of these figures, of course they have these objects, but you're like, oh no, like you've just armed them, and it's more than just their kind of passive identity. Like we were at war for much of the colonial period with those who had already inhabited the lands. And so it's a really complicated image. I just present you the 1848 version, but it is definitely something that other scholars have looked into and explored these passive stories in things like our state seals and city seals. There's a great question about the body. And it's something I grapple with all the time. So I'll pose the question. I'll let Erin take a stab at it. I have a thought. It's asking about like talking about the inextricableness of the body and jewelry, the fact that it's on the body, it relates to the body. What do we do when the body's not part of the equation? Jewelry either that's intended not for the body, or jewelry as in a museum setting that will no longer be on a body. What happens with that relationship?
It's funny because this question comes up a lot when I think about my work and when I think about work that I really love. Even saying not for the body means the body is present. Mm-hmm. It's a negation, and therefore it's a confrontation. So the party is still engaged, or is still supposed to be engaged with the negation. Works that are not meant for the body, that just comes down to intention versus reception, and whether the artist's intention lines up with reception or not. I think it can depend on what the intentions are. I don't know if you can ever get away from the body in jewelry. I don't know if it's even that thought or that sentence is saying that the body is somehow unavoidable, and let's try and get away from it with this thought. I don't know. It's not that's a toughie. It's sort of like this weird, like circuitous philosophical question that keeps on going. So to break it down though into my work specifically, I have also been engaging in making art objects, or objects that are not necessarily great on the body, but great as things that exist on their own. Objects are just embedded in human history, and therefore they're a part of the body and in their interaction with the body. So for me, that's very important when I think about even making work that doesn't go on the body. But it's like, okay, if it's not going on the body, how does a body interact with it? Where does this object interact? I even have dreams of making work that is specifically for a museum, because I think the museum as a place to experience work also puts bodies in a place to experience work. And therefore, just because something is in a museum does not mean it's not engaging with bodies. In fact, it's engaging with bodies in a very specific relationship. The relationship is just not the same as a one-to-one. It's more nuanced in how it's presented. It's living, it's life. For me, when people buy my work or collect my work, I just get such warm feelings, because I think of it as my work gets to live with someone in their life. And I think I've said this to you, John, before too. Like, I find that so fascinating that objects live with people. And even if they're not interacting with your body, they're living with you. You're living with them. Um, and I don't know, when we give objects a body of personification and ask about its body present or not, I think it's always present. It's just at which measure, in which direction, artist intention. It's like all of that encompassed. It's a tough question because it escapes a single answer.
Yeah, I think you're right. The idea that you're making something that's a brooch or earrings or a bracelet, you've indicated where on the body it should be, where it should be shown. And it would be fascinating. I mean, if you really want to escape the body, you would have to kind of invent a new form, or a form that's not based on clipping or passing through holes and symmetrical. There's just a whole new vocabulary you would have to escape. So there is this tacit acknowledgement of the body. I oversee a world of objects that are divorced from their use. The chairs will never get sat in. The teapots will never get filled with tea. The brooches will not get worn. If I pause about that, it can make me sad. At the same time, we can still appreciate them. But this idea of, is something successful because it functions well? Like, is the weight of a necklace and how it lays, is that the measure of success, or is it a different rubric? Does the coffee pot actually pour well without dribbling? Is that the measure of success? And when you take something if you take that one question out, you want to know that something is well weighted or it pours well, but I don't know. You make your own worlds.
And it's funny because this question does have like a personal resonation with me, just because of the way I was taught and who my professor was, and how I think about it. And I'd say in the past 5 years, I've more matured into my stance on it. And I think that the question of body present work also has inklings of, if the work is meant to be worn and meant for the body, it should be able to be worn. And if it's not meant to be worn, then it shouldn't be able to be worn. But that comes down to a functionality question, and that's not whether the body is present or not. That's whether your intentions lines up with your execution. So like for me as a person from Cranbrook, thinking about scale, and I make big work, and some things I intend to be worn, and some things I fully let Stefan at Ornamentum know that this is a very nice piece and it likely requires a very heavy jacket. So it's just about understanding. And I think more as I've gotten into my early career development, I respect people who wear my work more and try to make my work, if it's meant to be wearable, a bit easier to be worn as well, even if it's at a larger scale, because it's also about understanding that the functionality of things do matter if you want them to function.
I think that might be a nice way to end, because I think things can function as functional objects, as aesthetic objects. Linking back to kind of our idea of queerness, also coming from worlds where you make your own families and you make your own logic. I think these objects that may be covering by performing a supposed act, but they're really just out in the world experiencing the world. It's quite
Living,
resonant.
yeah,
They're living their best lives,
yeah.
whether they're a bracelet or a sculpture. And but I want to thank you so much for this rather freewheeling conversation where we've covered a couple hundred years of jewelry and metalsmithing. We've covered the military, we've covered making, and thank you for being so kind of open to the breadth of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you again for inviting me, and thank you for the work that you're doing for the jewelry world, especially. It's pretty amazing. I appreciate it.
Welcome, and I invite everybody to come to New Haven and visit Gold in America, Artistry, Memory, and Power, and American Jewelry, the Susan Grant Lewin collection at the Yale University Art Gallery. And there's a lot of other jewelry to see, a lot of other great things to see. You can also get some pizza. And then while you're in this neck of the woods, drive to Hudson, visit Ornamentum, and whatever you do, just go support your local jewelers and metalsmiths. So.
Yeah.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everyone.